I know, this is exciting. This is exciting, guys. So close to lunch break. Okay, maybe some of you at the back can close the doors. That helps a lot. Okay, thanks. Somebody up there, close the door, please. Yes, you. Okay. Let's get started. I have a quiz for you guys. Take out your phones, your tablets, whatever you have, whatever you use to update your Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, you know the drill. Take it out, go to this website and answer the question. Okay. Well, in this case, the question, that there are actually two answers that are correct here. Two things are correct here. The only thing that is not correct is that the first one, X, causally implies Y. That's wrong. That's wrong. That would be a correlation but not causation. A spurious effect is about that. The good thing is, guys, you still have 1 week until Monday to figure that out, to do the reading, right? Because what I decided to do, I'm preparing for this class, I'm thinking about what to tell you and what to explain to you and things like that. So I realized I should dwell a little more on the stuff that we talked about on Monday, which gives you another few days to learn and to read about a spurious correlation or spurious effects. We will come back to that on Monday, and there we will talk more about causality or all the other wonders around that. But as I said, I wasn't joking about this last time. I said, you guys need to open your eyes. That's really what this is all about, right? This is what university is about, but especially this course here. You need to open your eyes, and you need to think about ways. How can I devise a strategy to answer my question? Right? How can I go and find out stuff instead of just theorizing about something, but how can I go and collect some data to get an answer for a problem that I'm having? Right? You need to open your eyes. And because of that, I was thinking about, I was talking a little bit about explaining stuff, and I think a lot about how to explain stuff to you, but I realized that nobody tells you, nobody explains you how to make an explanation. And that's actually very important. That's sort of when we do research, that's very important. Because only when you convincingly can make an explanation, then I buy your argument, right? And you can see when somebody explains something in a bad way, you wonder what the hell is this guy talking about, right? But when somebody explains something to you very straightforwardly in a very clear way, you buy the argument. That's as simple as that. And that's sort of how it works in the academic world as well. We constantly make claims, and we have to defend these claims. So when I say something about the social world, I'm writing papers, and I show this to my colleagues, I need to convince them that I make a good explanation. And because of that, we're going to talk today a little more about how we actually make explanations. And it's actually not that straightforward. It's not trivial. You would think, oh, that's so trivial. No, it's not trivial. Making a clear and simple explanation is actually very difficult. It's much simpler to make a complicated, difficult explanations. But then you don't buy it in the first instance. And while we're doing that, so that's going to be most of the time today, and then after that we're just going to hammer out some definitions, some stuff that you guys already read. I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page, that we all use the same concepts, what a theory is, what a hypothesis is, and things like that. Often I see proposals or students writing stuff, and they use these terms in the wrong way. So we need to know what we're talking about, and you need to be clear about, okay, what are these things. Anyway, but before we get to all of these wonders about explanations, and so I want to backtrack a little bit, because we had this funny thing at the end, right? So that the Vatican, has the highest crime rate of all the countries in the world. It's one of those things, you can tell people, and if you want to impress somebody, okay, what did you learn? Well, here we are, over a dinner party or over on a cocktail party or whatnot. Just want to make sure that you guys actually understood the reasoning here, right? It's a very simple thing. It starts with how we calculate crime rates. Crime rate is calculated as crime per population, right? Then the Vatican has a very small population. There are only around 450 people living there, some monks, Pope, some other dudes. And then there are a lot of criminal offenses in the territory of the Vatican, right? It's sort of on the square in front of the Vatican, technically belongs to the Vatican. It's its own country, right? They have their own citizenship and whatnot. And as soon as the offenses happen there, they count as crimes happening in the Vatican. And that's sort of, so even, I don't know, it's still a relatively small number, although there are sort of 600 offenses if you compare it to another country like Ireland. But then if you put it into the relation to the number of people that live there, that's sort of how we end up with these high crime rates. And that's sort of one of the solution for this puzzle here, right? So it's about, this is a puzzle about calculating stuff, right? Where that is sort of where the solution is. And we will come back to some of these things later on. But it is a puzzle, right? And so now let's assume we have a real puzzle, right? We have something, I told you, we look at the stuff, and we actually then, the first thing we do, we establish the facts. We establish the facts to make sure that it is a true puzzle, that it's not something like the crime rate here, right? That we can easily knock over, but that it is a true puzzle. We look at things very closely, right? We put all the x-rays on it that we have, and then we still find something confusing. Right? Then we still find more engineers and terrorist groups. Or we still find something else, that there's more, there are more female suicides in China than male suicides. So that's sort of the things, we look at it and then we have the puzzle. So then the next step is, and this is sort of where we come in, how do we explain this? Right? And as I hope to show you, it's actually not that trivial, but there are some clear strategies about going about this. I think I already mentioned, one of my heroes, that's this guy, Jon Elster. He's a professor at Columbia University right now, and he wrote this beautiful book explaining social behavior. So in case you're interested in learning more about these kind of things that I'm talking about today, or also a little bit about last Monday, have a look at this book. Actually, I uploaded a text from this book onto Blackboard as well, so I updated the syllabus there a little bit. You can have a look at this. Well, Jon Elster, he champions what we call the hypothetical deductive model. It's nothing that he came up with, but he sort of pushes this, and he outlines this very straightforwardly in this first chapter of this book. What is it? It's a strategy for explaining something. And that's basically his recipe. Yeah? So follow these 5 steps to make an explanation. And what I will do with you, I will walk you through each of these steps. So he says, okay, first let's say we have a puzzle, right? We have something that we know is out there. It's not just an artifact or a statistical artifact or something else, right? And then he says, okay, let's start. Let's first choose a theory that holds out the greatest promise for successful explanation. Okay. Next step, specify a hypothesis that applies the theory to the puzzle in the sense that the explanandum, that's sort of what you want to explain, follows logically from the hypothesis. Okay, next step, identify plausible alternatives, right? Other accounts that could equally well explain your puzzle. And then he comes in and says, okay, and then we go through these rival accounts and we try to knock them out, one after the other. We try to refute them by pointing to additional implications. You will see in a minute what I mean by that, or what he means by that. We think about if the alternative would be true, what would that mean? What would that mean on the top of what we already observed? And then we can go and look and see if these implications are true, if that's something that we actually see in the world, right? That's sort of it's a very clever way of doing things, and you will hopefully understand that as it becomes clear when I walk you through the example. And then the last point, he says, we need to strengthen our original hypothesis that we have, right? So this is our most favorite one, and he outlines different strategies for that. He calls it support from below or support from above, but there we actually also look at something else that we didn't look into the first instance. So if our original hypothesis is true, then we think about, okay, what else would have to be true? What are the implications? What follows from our original hypothesis? And then we look at these additional things on the top of the original relationship we have in mind. So that's sort of a very, very convincing strategy by thinking about implications of both our alternative explanations and of our original explanation. Okay, so first we start, find your best explanation, right? That's sort of how it is, and I said this can be a creative process. Yeah, this can be a creative process. It's sort of where you're required to, well, you use the thing between your ears, right? So use that and think about it. You can have a good explanation based on something that you read before, right? Or because you just opened your eyes. Then the next step is you find alternative explanations. So what else could explain this phenomenon? Now, what are other equally good accounts? And you remember in one of the first lectures I talked about this idea of parsimony, right? So that kind of when we are faced with two different theories or two different explanations for the same thing, that then we should go for the simpler one. That's parsimony. That's the idea. But sometimes two explanations are equally simple. So what are we going to do then, right? That's sort of these alternatives, and then we use this, what I think is a very convincing way, this model that Elsa suggests, to knock these alternatives out. That's what we need to do. And the harder you hit, the more you knock them out, the more convinced I am at the end of the day. Okay. So let's start with a puzzle, right? So I'm going to walk you through these 5 steps with one example. So you're an Elster, you know this guy that I admire. You know, by the way, he's one of those guys, you know, when he comes into the room and you stand next to him, and then you just don't know what to talk about, right? Because you would think, I just can look ridiculous here, right? I had this a few times in my life, you know, with I don't know, Thomas Schelling, Nobel Prize winner, or Stephen Hawking that I met, and you stand there, and then those guys, and you wonder, I can ask you something about the weather, but I would look completely stupid. So anyway, so Jon Elster is one of those guys that gives me the jitters, and he's a guy, lives in New York, likes to go to musicals, right? That's what older professors do, you know. They have time, they have money, there they go, and he made this observation. It's a casual observation for him. He observes that Broadway shows nowadays receive more standing ovations than 20 years ago. So that's one of those things where the guy opens his eyes, right? So he just looks around and says, okay, well, hang on, how could that be? So that's sort of a puzzle. That's a puzzle for him. Now let's imagine that he established the facts, you know, he did his research, maybe he collected some data about it, you know, that it actually is truly the case, right? That is sort of not a thingy, but it's actually really true. Objectively, there are more people standing up at the end of Broadway shows. So what does the hypothesis, the model that Elster champions suggest? Well, first, choose a theory that holds out the greatest promise for a successful explanation. Okay. So Elsa thinks about stuff and he comes up with this explanation. He says, maybe it is about increased ticket prices. Why should that affect the number of standing ovations at the end of the day? Well, Elsa has a theory. Well, first of all, he observed something else. So he not only observed that there are more people standing up in Broadway shows at the end, but he also observed that those shows got more expensive during the last 20 years. Right? So we have here an association, X and Y. We'll talk about more about that on Monday. There's an association. But does that imply a causal relationship? Is there sort of that the one leads to the other? Well, Elsa, he comes up with this theory, right? And his theory is that, okay, when people pay a lot of money for something, they feel bad about it, right? On the one side, they spend a lot of money on something else. What they're going to do in consequence, they're going to tell themselves that what they bought was very good. Right? There's sort of this idea, I don't know, you guys pay a lot of money for your education, and then afterwards you get a shitty degree, but you tell yourself that it's an awesome degree. That's sort of this idea here. It's actually not that you will see later on, that's actually a very serious theory. It's a very serious theory that has much wider implications. So people feel bad about it when they spend a lot of money for something, and then they tell themselves that it was actually good to resolve that inner conflict. Actually, in the theory, it's called dissonance. To resolve that inner conflict, and then they feel better about it. So here's sort of what he writes. I shall consider an explanations in terms of the rising prices of Broadway tickets, and then he quotes somebody where he read something that I guess the audience just feels having paid $75 to sit down, it's their time to stand up. I don't mean to be cynic, but it probably all changed when the price went up. When people have to pay $75 or more for a seat, many cannot admit to themselves that the show was poor or mediocre, and that they have wasted their money. To confirm themselves that they had a good time, they applaud wildly. And so that's sort of where Elster used his brain, or actually some stuff that he had read about before as well, to have a theory about why there are more standing ovations at the end of Broadway shows. Okay, then the next step, right, in this 5-step model that Elster suggests. So specify a hypothesis that applies the theory to the puzzle, in the sense that the explanandum follows logically from the hypothesis. Okay, so we have this one thing called explanandum. That's basically what we want to explain. Right here we have more standing ovations. Right, that's sort of what needs to be explained. And on the other side we have the explanans. The explanans is what we use to explain our explanandum. So where from we start. So we have the increased ticket prices on the one side, and we have the standing ovations on the other side. And then I hope to have convinced you in one of the first lectures that we also need to have a mechanism in between, like a plausible story, how we get from the one to the other. And that's in our hypothesis, right? But now, as I said, there can be many different mechanisms leading from the one thing to the other, right? And all of them could be equally well. Well, actually, you could look at your data, and your data, you find lots of correlations, which is not causation, right? You find lots of correlations between different variables, but there's no, you might even have you can come up with a plausible story. You can come up with a plausible story, but it's actually not what has been driving this thing. So it's not actually what led to the puzzle. Okay, so we specify our hypothesis. We have now a clear hypothesis, right? Standing ovations on the one side, ticket prices on the other side. Okay. Now Elster says, identify or imagine plausible accounts that might provide alternative explanations. Also in the sense that the explanation follows logically from each of them. Okay. So Elster thinks about what else could have been the driving factor here, that there are more standing ovations. Well, one explanation he comes up with is, he says, maybe the audience changed. Maybe over the last 20 years, there's just so many people from New Jersey now coming in, and those guys, they're just so easy to impress. It's just not the cleverest people. Yeah. Don't watch that show. Yeah. Seriously. So that's now an alternative explanation that Jon comes up with. He says that maybe it is about the audience being different, right? It's actually, it's a reasonable explanation, right? It's plausible. Maybe there are just different kinds of people that go to the Broadway shows nowadays, right? And that has changed. So that's sort of an alternative explanation. Another alternative that Esther comes up with is maybe those shows just got better. It's possible, right? Maybe the quality of Broadway shows just increased over the last 20 years. And that is why nowadays there are more people standing up at the end of a show. It's a perfectly reasonable explanation. It's absolutely fine. I don't see any reason why the one should be simpler than the other, right? All three of these are perfectly fine explanations. So here, again, it would be fit in the schema. We have the standing ovations, and now the explanans is that this shows just got better. And we can think about the mechanism, when people like something, they applaud or they stand up and so on. So now we have one hypothesis and we have two alternatives, right? Okay, now Elsa says, for each one of these rival accounts, go into them and refute them by pointing to additional testable implications that are in fact not observed. Additional implications. So not kind of the stuff that we actually observe, what we are interested in the first instance, but what would follow if the whole thing is driven by the Jersey Shore? Or what would follow if the whole thing is driven by increased quality of the Broadway shows? So these are additional implications that we might not be interested in the first instance, but they can help us to get this leverage, to kind of tease these things apart from each other. And when we the analysis that I do, or I don't know, the papers that I read, these are sort of the cool papers, where kind of people find this leverage, right? To say, okay, they are equally fine to explain one thing, these explanations, but they don't explain something else in the same way. And then by looking at the difference and this something else, I can get a better understanding in what was the original explanation in the first instance. Okay. So Elsa says we can provide for our hypothesis support from the side, or he calls it lateral support, and that basically means taking our alternative explanations, thinking about other implications from that, and trying to knock our alternative explanations out based on not observing this alternative, all these implications that would follow from the alternative explanation. So we take the Jersey Shore argument, right? We take it. This is sort of how it looks like. And now we think, if that is true, well, if it is about the audience being different, then we would also observe more standing ovations when we go actually to New Jersey. So when we have out-of-town performances of the Broadway show, the musical, sometimes they travel around and so on. If it is about those New Yorkers, and they are just completely blasé, they're arrogant, I don't know, yeah? They are just too spoiled, and the people in the countryside are not, then if we would take the same musical and they travel around the countryside, then we would observe more standing ovations there as well. Right? Another explanation would be, or another implication of this Jersey Shore argument would be, if for whatever reason those guys cannot come to New York, I don't know, there's a snowstorm or whatnot, right? And sometimes some really cool stuff uses exactly these kind of things, like a real natural experiment, where something happens. Economists love this stuff, but even in sociology you find amazing stuff like that. Something happens which blocks the access to Manhattan, for example. Or which leads to another situation, and then if our explanation, if this alternative would be true, then in this case we would actually see fewer standing ovations. Why? Because those guys cannot come to Manhattan to see the Broadway shows. So that's sort of an implication. Both of these things are implications of our alternative explanation. So if that would be true, that's how we start thinking. We start thinking about what is our original hypothesis, and then we think about alternatives, and then we think about what would the alternatives imply if the alternatives would be true. And then when we can refute that, let's say we don't find that. We don't find that there's fewer standing ovations when the access roads are blocked, or we find that there are fewer standing ovations for exactly the same shows when they are elsewhere in the countryside in New Jersey somewhere, that actually gives us some convincing evidence that our alternative explanation is not true. So following this logic, thinking about the implications of our alternative explanations, we can knock them out. So now I would have knocked this one out. Let's move on to the next alternative explanation. So as I said, it could be that the quality of the shows just got better. Here we are. That's sort of our suggested alternative explanation. It's absolutely reasonable. Makes a lot of sense. What would that imply? What are potential implications if that would be true? Well, then he says, then those shows would get better reviews as well. Right? I can go and look at the reviews that people wrote in newspapers about Broadway shows, and then look at how favorably were these shows reviewed. And if they got better, they would have to get better reviews as well. Right? That's sort of an implication of this alternative that we have. A second implication, as I suggest, when those shows are better, and we would say, and this implies that the people like the show, people go to the show, they should actually run longer as well. So you see now we think, and this is sort of where the creative process comes in. We have to use the thing between your ears. You have to think about not only about the alternatives, but also about what are the implications of the alternatives, and does this give me the leverage to then actually knock these alternatives out. That's sort of what you need to think about, because then when we can show that this is actually not the case, I look at the reviews in newspaper articles of the Broadway shows, and I see steady. There's not, I don't know, I can measure this somehow or whatever. I look at how many times they are excited or how many times they use certain words and so on. Look at it over time. I don't find a change, or I don't find a change in how long these shows run. This sort of gives me some evidence to question this alternative explanation, right? And the better I am in thinking about the implications of my alternatives and refuting these or not observing these implications, the better I am in knocking this thing out. 2 down. Okay, so that's sort of how you deal with the alternative explanation, and that's what Elsa calls lateral support for a theory, or from the side. Okay, the fifth point that Elster mentions is, okay, we now have our theory, we had our hypothesis, we came up with some alternatives for that, we started to knock these alternatives out, but that's not enough yet either. Right? He says on the top of that, we should provide further evidence for our original hypothesis by thinking about what are the additional things that would follow from our hypothesis. So Elster calls this excess explanatory power. So when you have a good theory, often this theory explains not just one thing, but lots of other things as well, right? So that's sort of, and these other things that you didn't look at in the first instance, that would be what Elster calls novel facts. That's something else. And then if you can show that we can observe these novel facts, these other implications, right? What would follow if our hypothesis would be true? This provides further evidence. So we try to, in both cases of the alternatives and of the original hypothesis, we think of the implications from this stuff. And then for the alternatives, we want to knock them out based on not finding the implications. And for the original hypothesis, if we do find the implications for something that we didn't think about in the first instance, something else that our theory explains as well, excess explanatory power, then we can be more confident at. I think that's a very convincing strategy. So let's look at what Elsa then calls support from below. So that's sort of a way of providing this additional support for additional implications that would follow from your original hypothesis. So we have this, it's all about higher ticket prices. Higher ticket prices people feel bad, they tell themselves that this is great, and that's sort of why at the end they stand up, because they cannot admit to themselves that they just wasted a lot of money. So that's sort of our explanation. If that would be true, that's sort of how you have to think. If that would be true, what would it mean? What would it imply? Well, it would imply that if for whatever reason there's a show where the prices didn't increase, for these shows you would observe fewer standing ovations, right? If it's all about standing up, ticket prices going up, people stand up. If some shows, for whatever reason, I don't know, there's an old theater and they didn't want to increase the prices or whatnot. Yeah? If that would be the case, then you would observe fewer standing ovations for these shows. Another implication. Well, think about those free tickets that are being given away. Right? So now imagine it happens all the time. Right? It happens all the time. Companies, they buy chunks of tickets and they give them away, Christmas presents or whatnot, to their employees. So now the employees, these are the people that at the end of the day are in the Broadway show, right? They didn't pay anything for it. They got it for free. Right? If our theory would be right, if our hypothesis here would be right, that it's all about increased ticket prices that people pay, and then kind of they feel bad about it, and then they kind of tell themselves afterwards that they kind of watched something great, they witnessed something amazing, then they stand up. If that would be true, then those guys shouldn't stand up when they got the tickets for free. Because they don't feel bad about it. Because they didn't waste anything. Again, you see, this is sort of an implication, and often we try to find these circumstances, okay, and this provides us very powerful leverage. You can just see where I'm going with this, right? So because then we can look at the shows, right? We can look at I don't know how many percentage of tickets were given out for free for one show, right? And then we look at, okay, are there more people standing up? So there we're moving away from just plainly testing our hypothesis. And some people do that, and it's fine. They just look at a correlation, or they find a fancy statistical model to relate the one thing to the other, which is great. Which is where you need to start. But then the real magic comes into play when you do these other things. Right? When you kind of show these other implications, and you knock out not just the alternative explanation, but the implications of the alternatives, and when you can provide evidence for implications of the original hypothesis. And when we do this kind of analysis, in statistics, I don't know, we're probably not going to get there, but maybe at some other course you hear about that. That's actually where you use interaction effects, where you say, okay, one effect is there, it's perhaps the one increase in X leads to an increase in Y, but only if Z is present, right? So then you would observe this relationship between X and Y, between variables, but only when something else is true as well. So that's sort of, practically you would use interaction effects for this kind of stuff. So then when I find evidence for these things, for these implications of my original hypothesis that I have, it provides me some reasonable evidence. I'm much more so convinced that that this is actually true, right? So that would mean our hypothesis is the last man standing. We knocked all the other ones out. We provided some solid evidence for that the implications of our original hypothesis is true. This is where we are. This is how it looks like in a textbook. So you go these steps. But then there's sort of one other way, how Elsa says, how we can support our original claim. Remember, we have the support from the side, natural support, not from the alternatives, right? We have support from below. That's kind of looking at implications of our hypothesis that we have. The third one that Elsa outlines is support from above. So support from above, imagine, okay, now here's our explanation. Ticket prices, standing ovations. We know it, we talked about it now, right? Support from above means there is a well-established theory that explains these things on a larger scale. Right? And actually, I mentioned earlier, there is actually a very established theory here. We call it the theory of cognitive dissonance. It's a guy that Leon Festinger came up, and this theory is very general, and it says, okay, whenever there are some internal dissonance among beliefs and values, right? So you have certain things, you believe in the one thing, but you're faced with this other situation here. You know why? I don't know, you don't like to lie, but you're forced to lie. Right? That's sort of an internal conflict. That's what Festinger calls cognitive dissonance. Then you have that, and then he says, okay, well, a natural thing that humans do, we try to resolve this dissonance by either moving one thing or the other, right? Well, if you're forced to lie, you cannot change that, but you can change the way about what you think is a lie. So actually, and there's support for that, people start then believing in the lie. There are these wonderful experiments that you can see. Social psychologists do a lot of amazing stuff, and that's really, really cool stuff. I don't know if you guys have some courses here on that. But how people then, they know something is wrong. They know something is wrong, but then they lie. Because everybody else says that, I don't know, there are these psychological experiments or social psychological experiments where people then follow the norm. And then they even tell themselves, if you ask them afterwards, they say, no, it wasn't a lie. Although it was obviously a lie. So that's a very general theory. It's cognitive dissonance, and the thing about cognitive. Oh, actually, here I have a little comic for how this goes. So I'm going to read it out to you. It's a little small. So there's this job interview. Yeah? There's sort of this boss sitting there and asks the applicants, "Why should I hire you as my consultant?" Then the applicant says, "I use my special process of cognitive dissonance to improve employee morale." Then the boss asks, how does it work? The applicant says, when people are in an absurd situation, their minds rationalize it by inventing a comfortable illusion. And then the boss says, okay, go for it, let's try it. And the applicant goes out and to one of the colleagues and asks his colleague, or this person who works there, isn't it strange that you have this dead-end job when you're twice as smart as your boss? He goes on, the hours are long, the pay is mediocre, nobody respects your contributions, and yet you freely choose to work here. Sounds familiar, huh? Then the guy says it's absurd. Yeah. No, wait, hang on, there must be something else. There must be a reason. I must work here because I love the work. And he says, oh, I love this job. Touché. Yeah? That sort of cognitive dissonance. This guy created the dissonance between the guy working here, obviously, right? He kind of told them bad things about the job, and then the guy was there, they had this internal conflict, and then cognitive dissonance he tried to resolve. Right? Telling himself, I love this job. It's funny because last time I told you that I love my job. Anyway, cognitive dissonance. And now this is a general theory, right? And has been widely tested, not just with ticket prices of Broadway shows and people going to stand up at the end of the day, but there's a lot of evidence for that. People who smoke. People know smoking is bad, but they do smoke. What they start often, when you ask them, they rationalize it somehow. They say, oh, lots of other people smoke. Smoking is not that bad. Right? So they start trying to resolve this internal dissonance. Or another example, I already mentioned this. People believe that lying is wrong, right? But they are forced to lie in whatever situation, and then they're forced to it. And then what they start doing, often you observe that people start believing in a lie. So there's a plethora of research out there. This has been around for a time, and I'm fascinated by this kind of stuff. But that's now, you remember our case of the Broadway show. This is sort of something from above, right? It's something, a more general theory that we have that helps us to make sense of the little folk theory that Elster came up with, right? That it's about ticket prices, and that leads to more standing ovations. So support from above, it can make us feel more confident about this. Right? Because there are other things, if our theory would be true, there are other things that actually some other people already found out. Right? Again, it's sort of thinking about these implications of something else. But now not thinking in terms of implication of what this particular thing of the Broadway show means, but what are the implications of the wider theory from above. Okay, so we have these three things. Right? I hope to convince you. We have support from the side, knocking out the alternative explanations, support from below, finding other implications for our hypothesis that would be true, and then we see if we actually can find them, and we can provide support from above, which is through this general theory that could explain our phenomenon. Okay, so that's sort of walking you through the explanation. I hope you bought this now, with what Elsa says. It's a fascinating guy, and I think it makes a lot of sense. I think it makes a lot of sense. So if you read up more on this thing, I have it written up. I have the chapter where he outlines these kind of things. He doesn't have any pretty pictures, but that's my job. You find it on Blackboard. What I want to do now we talked about a whole bunch of stuff. What is a theory, a hypothesis, but we never really talked about this. Right? And there was a reading. I think for last time. You all did. You all did these things. Now we actually can apply them. So now I'm going to use these things. Now I find it incredibly boring. I told you I don't like boring stuff. I find it incredibly boring. Just give you a definition and that's it. But now we have this thing. Now we have this explanation, right? And I hope that I convince you guys. Now we can use this explanation as an example to talk about, okay, what is a theory? What is a theory? And now a theory is a set of interrelated constructs or propositions intended to explain and predict a phenomenon. So it's basically a general idea about how things work. And a theory explains not just one thing. A theory explains lots of different things. So a theory is we'll come back to that in a moment, but a theory is when you apply it to your particular problem, it solves your problem. Or it gives you an answer for your puzzle. It gives you an explanation. Sort of a general thing, like this cognitive dissonance thing. Right? There's nothing about ticket prices there, or there's nothing about road ratios in there. It's sort of a general theory. And then we can use that and apply that to the puzzle that we have. We come back to that to derive a proposition, with constructs and concepts and blah, 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 with some measures that we have, and then we actually have our hypothesis that we actually test. So that's sort of the theory, there's sort of this broader thing at the top, that comes from above. And the example, there's sort of this guy, Leon Festinger, cognitive dissonance theory. Cognitive dissonance leads to a readjustment, mental readjustment, so that the dissonance is being reduced. That's a theory. Okay, now we can talk about concepts. What are concepts? Concepts are sort of generalizable properties or characteristics that are associated with objects, events, or people. So that's sort of still abstract stuff. Yeah? So Festinger has this thing about, okay, there's sort of dissonance and then there's mental adjustment. So you see there's sort of a relation here. So the concepts here are internal dissonance and mental adjustment. These are the concepts. Yeah? These are sort of things, sort of abstractions of what we don't really know what it is yet. And the theory is sort of a relation, is sort of a collection, a set of these different concepts and how they are related with each other. So that's sort of a concept now. Internal dissonance or mental adjustment. Then we have a construct. A construct, now sometimes it's hard, what is a construct, what is a concept? For me, a construct is just something more specific than a concept. It's sort of this mental adjustment is sort of still very broad, or what could it be? A construct could be being happy, right? So you see, this is sort of more specific. So there could be another mental adjustment, right? That's the concept. But being happy, we still don't know what that is. But that's sort of something that we then go and measure somehow, right? Or that's sort of a more general entity than just a particular measure, right? These constructs, we then go and we measure them. And then we have a variable, right? So a variable holds basically measurable things, right? And that's a measurable representation of a construct. And we can go, this is sort of would be a clear variable here. We look at the percentage of people who stand up after a show. That's something that we measure. That's sort of a variable, right? If you have a data set, this is sort of the thing that you have. The other things, you don't have them in your data set, right? And the people that don't know how to do this stuff, they don't think about that concept. They don't think about that theory or that proposition. They just look at the variables. It's very easy to do that, but that's a great mistake. So don't make that. So always keep these different things in mind. That we have the theories, the construct, the concept, the constructs, and now we're actually at the level of the variables down here. Then the next thing is we have a proposition. And now hopefully you understand what these different levels are. Now we have the theory. The theory relates our concepts, right? These abstract things, like cognitive dissonance and mental adjustment. The proposition is what would our theory mean for this scenario here, right? At the level of the constructs. So that's sort of a level further below, right? There's nothing here about mental adjustment anymore, or nothing about cognitive dissonance, but a proposition would be sort of, okay, what does it mean here on the ground? And the proposition would be people who pay a high price for something justify the high price by thinking that whatever they bought is good. That's a proposition. And so you have your theory, and then you derive a proposition from your theory, and then in the next step, actually, because you still cannot really test, that's not a hypothesis yet, right? That's sort of applying your theory to the constructs that you have, or to the concepts that you have. And but then the next thing is the hypothesis. The hypothesis actually then goes further down to the level of the measures. And that's sort of an empirical formulation of a proposition. That's what a hypothesis is. And examines the relation between your corresponding variables for the constructs. And that's something that we can test. That's often something very precise, right? So that's sort of now, people who pay more money for a Broadway show are more likely to stand up. You see, there's nothing about I don't know, fuzzy spending a lot of money, or fuzzy about being happy or something like that, but it's really down to the level of the measures. That's kind of the stuff that you test, and that's the hypothesis. Okay, well guys, I said there is another reading, the reading that was for today. If you belong to the category of people who said that the first answer is true, read up on it. I'm going to ask exactly the same question on Monday again. If you want to read more about the fun stuff that I talked about today, look at this chapter by Esther. Okay, thank you.